On a cool, crisp autumn evening, the park was almost deserted. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky that was fading from purple to black. A few joggers, wrapped in their jackets, strolled along the winding paths, their footsteps the only sound in the quiet space. The park was a peaceful haven during the day, but as night descended, it transformed into a world of shadows and secrets. In one corner of the park, just beneath a large oak tree, a small, trembling creature lay motionless on the ground. It was a bat, its dark wings sprawled out awkwardly as if they no longer served their purpose. The bat's once sleek body was bruised and battered, and its eyes, though open, seemed unfocused, lost in a haze of confusion and pain. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The bat had been born in the wild, free to navigate the skies, dipping and soaring through the cool night air. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps it had collided with a building or been struck by a car, or maybe it had simply fallen from a tree. Whatever the reason, it now found itself lying alone in the dirt, far from the familiar comfort of its colony. It was helpless, injured, and unable to fly. Just as the bat's vision blurred, a soft voice pierced through the silence. A woman, walking her dog along the path, had noticed the bat lying there. The dog tugged at the leash, eager to continue its walk, but the woman was stopped in her tracks. She knelt down beside the tiny creature, her breath fogging the cool air. She carefully reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the bat's delicate body. The woman knew little about bats, but she could tell this one was in trouble. Its wing was bent at an odd angle, and its tiny chest rose and fell with labored breaths. "Poor thing," she whispered, her heart aching for the bat's plight. Without a second thought, she gently cupped the bat in her hands, being careful not to hurt it further. She tucked it into her jacket to keep it warm as she stood and looked around the park. Her name was Sophie, and though she had always been an animal lover, she had never expected to find herself in this situation. She glanced down at the small, fragile creature in her hands. "What am I going to do with you?" she muttered under her breath, already sensing that this little bat's journey was far from over. She knew she couldn't just leave it here to suffer. Her mind raced as she tried to think of where to take the bat. She remembered a wildlife center she had heard about a few miles away, a place that specialized in rehabilitating injured animals. Sophie didn't hesitate. The bat needed help, and she would do whatever it took to give it a chance. Sophie carefully placed the bat in the crook of her arm, keeping it warm against her chest. She hurried home, making sure the bat remained safe and secure. As she walked, she couldn't help but wonder about the bat's story. What had happened to it? How had it ended up in the park alone and injured? And what would happen to it now? When Sophie finally reached her apartment, she immediately made a phone call to the wildlife center. The voice on the other end was kind and reassuring, explaining that they would be happy to take in the bat and give it the care it needed. Sophie breathed a sigh of relief and made arrangements to drive the bat to the center the following morning. The night felt long as she lay awake, worrying about the tiny creature she had found. The uncertainty of its fate gnawed at her, and she found herself imagining what it would be like to see the bat flying freely again, soaring through the sky with the wind beneath its wings. But for now, all she could do was wait, hoping that the wildlife center would be able to help. The morning sun had barely risen when Sophie carefully placed the bat in a small, cushioned box, ready to take it to the wildlife center. The city was waking up around her, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional chirp of birds perched on the trees, the soft clink of a coffee cup. But none of this mattered to Sophie. All she could think about was the bat, its fragile body, and the uncertain road ahead. The wildlife center wasn't far, but Sophie drove with a sense of urgency, glancing nervously at the small box on the passenger seat as she maneuvered through the quiet streets. Every so often, she would look over at the bat, tucked safely inside, hoping it was still breathing steadily, that it was still hanging on. When she finally arrived, a young woman named Emily greeted her at the door. Emily worked at the center and was one of the specialists who took care of injured wildlife. She had an easy smile and a gentle demeanor, but there was a seriousness in her eyes as she took the box from Sophie's hands. "Let's get him inside and see what we're working with," Emily said softly, walking quickly into the building. The warmth of the wildlife center was a stark contrast to the chill outside. Inside, there were cages, enclosures, and the unmistakable scent of animals, some calm, some restless. Sophie followed Emily into a back room where a table was set up for examination. Emily gently unwrapped the bat from its makeshift blanket, her hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had seen it all before. The bat, still weak but alive, lay there, its wings fluttering slightly. Emily's brow furrowed as she inspected the tiny creature. The bat's left wing was definitely injured, and it was clear it hadn't eaten in a while. "It's a little male, probably a young one," Emily murmured to herself, turning to Sophie. "Looks like he's been through quite an ordeal." Sophie nodded, her throat tight. "Will he be okay?" Emily gave her a reassuring smile, though Sophie could tell the road to recovery wouldn't be easy. "We'll do everything we can. First, we'll get him stabilized, and then we'll see about the extent of the injury. It's possible we'll need to give him some time before he's strong enough to fly again." Sophie felt a small wave of relief. At least the bat was in capable hands. Over the next few days, Sophie received updates from Emily. The bat had been named Echo by the staff, a name that seemed fitting for such a fragile and mysterious creature. Emily had carefully treated the bat's wing, ensuring it was properly bandaged. They had also given him fluids and food to help regain some strength. Echo, though still weak, had started to show signs of improvement. His eyes, which had once been dull and unfocused, now had a glimmer of life. He had started to move more, though cautiously, as if testing his new limits. As the days passed, Sophie couldn't help but visit Echo whenever she had the chance. She would stop by after work, bringing him some fresh fruit or just sitting quietly by his enclosure. Though the bat didn't recognize her, Sophie felt a deep connection to him. She had found him in his moment of need, and now, she felt like it was her responsibility to see him through to a better life. Emily had explained that bats were resilient creatures. They had an incredible ability to heal, especially when given the proper care. It would take time, but Sophie was patient. She understood that the bat's journey wouldn't be quick, it would require perseverance. And then, one morning, she received a call that changed everything. "Good news, Sophie," Emily said over the phone. "Echo's ready for his next step. He's strong enough to start flying again. We're going to give him a chance to stretch his wings in our flight cage." Sophie's heart leapt. She had been anxiously awaiting this moment, the moment when she could see Echo fly again. That afternoon, Sophie rushed to the wildlife center. When she arrived, Emily led her to the flight cage, a large, netted enclosure filled with tall branches and a few other bats that had been rehabilitated in the past. Echo was perched on a branch in the far corner, looking much healthier than the first time Sophie had seen him. His wings were no longer bound in bandages, and his fur looked glossy and smooth. "Are you ready to see him fly?" Emily asked, her eyes sparkling. Sophie nodded, her breath catching in her throat. With a gentle movement, Emily opened the gate to the flight cage. Echo, still a little unsure, took a few tentative steps toward the center. He paused, looking around at his new surroundings. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he spread his wings. The air seemed to hum with energy as Echo flapped, lifting off the branch and into the air. His flight was hesitant at first, wobbly, but then he began to glide with more confidence, his wings cutting through the air in slow, graceful arcs. Sophie's heart swelled with emotion as she watched him. This was it. This was the moment of freedom he had been waiting for, the moment when he could leave the confines of the cage and once again be part of the wild. But as Echo flew, Sophie noticed something she hadn't expected. The other bats in the enclosure had started to take notice. They fluttered around him, some cautiously, some curiously. And it wasn't long before Echo had made a few new companions, joining them in flight as if he had always belonged. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Sophie asked, watching as Echo circled higher. Emily smiled, her voice soft but confident. "He'll be fine. He's strong now, and in the wild, he'll find his way. He's a survivor." Sophie could hardly believe it. The bat she had found in the park, weak and alone, was now soaring through the sky, surrounded by others of his kind. For a moment, Sophie stood there, her heart full, as she realized that Echo's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about rebirth. But as much as she was happy for him, Sophie knew this wasn't the end. Echo's story was just beginning. And, in some strange way, hers was too. Weeks passed, and Sophie's visits to the wildlife center became less frequent. She had seen Echo's progress with her own eyes, and while she knew his rehabilitation was nearing its end, a part of her felt reluctant to let go. The small bat who had once been so fragile was now a strong, capable creature, flying gracefully through the flight cage with the others, adapting to the rhythms of the night. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, Sophie received a message from Emily. It was simple, yet its words made her heart race. "Echo's ready for release. We'd like you to be there." Sophie felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, pride, sadness, and even a little fear. Would Echo truly be ready to survive on his own again? Could he really find his way in the vast, open world? She had come to care for him deeply, and while she had always known that this day would come, the finality of it still stung. That evening, Sophie arrived at the center as the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle. The air was thick with the promise of night, the time when bats like Echo would come alive. Emily greeted her with a gentle smile, holding the small crate that contained Echo. Inside, Sophie could hear the soft rustle of wings, a comforting sound that meant the bat was ready. He had grown stronger, more confident, and it was time for him to leave the safety of the center and return to the wild. "Are you sure he's ready?" Sophie asked, her voice tight with emotion. "He is," Emily replied, her tone gentle but resolute. "He's been flying with the others for weeks. He's learned what he needs to survive out there. And besides, we've given him the best chance. Now, it's his turn to find his place in the world." Sophie nodded, though her heart remained heavy. She followed Emily to the center's back gate, where a small grove of trees stretched out toward the horizon. The park where she had found Echo all those weeks ago seemed so far away now, yet it felt like no time had passed at all. The familiar sounds of the city could still be heard faintly, but this was a different world, one where nature reigned. Standing at the edge of the trees, Sophie watched as Emily carefully opened the crate, revealing Echo. The little bat peered out cautiously, his dark eyes scanning the world around him. For a moment, he hesitated, as though unsure of what came next. His wings fluttered nervously, the shadows of the night stretching out like a blanket before him. "Go on, Echo," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's your turn now. You're free." At her words, Echo seemed to understand. With a quick, determined movement, he stretched out his wings and took flight, lifting into the air like a shadow against the night sky. His first few flaps were tentative, almost uncertain, but then he soared higher, gliding in long, smooth arcs. The other bats in the area began to stir, and soon Echo was joining them, darting among the trees, weaving in and out of the branches with the grace of one who had been born to fly. Sophie stood there, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him disappear into the night. This was his moment, his journey had come full circle. He was no longer the fragile, injured bat she had found in the park. He was a wild creature, reclaiming his place in the world. "I guess that's it," Sophie said softly, her eyes still fixed on the dark sky, where Echo had once again become just another bat in the vast wilderness. Emily stood beside her, offering a quiet smile. "He's home now, Sophie. And he'll never forget that you helped him get there." Sophie nodded, though she knew there would always be a part of her that would wonder about Echo. Would he thrive out there? Would he find the food he needed? Would he find other bats like him, maybe even start his own colony one day? She didn't know the answers, but she took comfort in the fact that he was free, and that he had been given a chance, thanks to her. As the last echoes of Echo's flight faded into the night, Sophie turned to leave. The air was colder now, and the city seemed quieter than before. But Sophie felt different, as though she had experienced something profound. She had rescued a bat, yes, but in doing so, she had also found something deeper within herself. A sense of purpose, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could make a world of difference. And just as she reached her car, a soft rustling noise caught her attention. She looked up, half expecting to see a group of bats returning to roost. But instead, it was just the wind, rustling the leaves of the trees. But for some reason, Sophie felt a warmth in her chest, as though Echo's presence was still with her, somewhere up above. And for a moment, she could almost imagine him, soaring freely, far from the confines of the center, dancing through the night sky, living his life as he was always meant to. It was then that Sophie realized, Sometimes, the smallest creatures could teach us the biggest lessons. And as long as there were animals like Echo, there would always be a reason to keep fighting for the wild.